Good evening, everyone. Can you all hear me? First question, I think yes. So welcome to this YPFP Brussels, a digital event focused on the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. What is the future for gender equality? This is the question we will be asking ourselves tonight and the core of our debate. This is the first event of our Gender Initiative 2020 that aims through a series of debates, expert interviews and publications at celebrating both the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, which we'll be discussing tonight, and the 20th anniversary of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security. Tonight, we have the pleasure to have here and the honor four prominent speakers and for different lenses through which we will look at the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, a groundbreaking and certainly the most inspiring instrument for women's rights and gender equality. We'll be looking at what is the BDPA and the achievements and shortfalls on promoting gender equality worldwide. And the speakers are Mrs. Dagmar Schumacher, head of UN Women Brussels office, Mr. Jakub Cais, statistics officer at the European Institute for Gender Equality, Mrs. Serap Altinisik. I'm sure, Serap, you will pronounce this better than me, head of EU office at Plan International, and Mrs. Fleur Heyworth, head of gender and inclusive security at the Geneva Center for Security Policy. Welcome to all the speakers. We're very grateful to have you tonight, and thanks for accepting this invite. Before we kick off with the debate, please allow me to quickly introduce myself and YPFP. My name is Diana De Vivo. I'm the Director of Programs at YPFP Brussels branch. As you know, YPFP is a not-for-profit organization which represents thousands of members around the world. Our aim is to foster the next generation of foreign policy leaders. So we do this through a series of tools, actually, to our professional trainings, to high-level events and debates like the one that we'll have here tonight. And we provide different network opportunities to our members. So as for our event tonight, I'm very much looking forward to exploring what is the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, this groundbreaking instrument of gender equality, women's rights, and critically assess what has been achieved in 25 years of implementation, and what is the outlook and what are the challenges for the future of gender equality. I'd like to ask all participants to use the hashtag YPFP4Gender if you like to interact on social media about tonight's event. So without further ado, let me give the floor to the speakers so we can immediately start and dive deep into the debate. And definitely we can start with Dagmar, head of office. I'm just going to remind you, as I introduced her before, of UN Women Brussels. So Dagmar, my first question would be for you. Recognizing that the status of women has advanced in some important areas in the past decades, but we're falling short in other areas. Could you please give us an overview and explore for us the Beijing Declaration Platform for Action, what it is, the 5 questions of the when, the how, the what, the who, and of course the why. What is the status of gender equality, in which areas we're falling behind, and what are the success stories based on also on the latest report UN Women published on the BDPA implementation. So thanks, Dagmar, and I'll leave the floor to you.
Thank you so much, Diana. I'm really happy to be here with all of you. And thank you also to IPFP to organize this event tonight. We definitely need more discussion on gender equality and more action on gender equality. And I think this forum with such a distinguished group and current and future leaders in foreign policies is particularly welcome. And I remember our discussion exactly a year ago, I think in the IPFP premises here in Brussels, when we could still get together physically. And we also discussed briefly about Beijing Plus 25. And I remember at that time I asked a question, who knows what the Beijing Platform of Action was? And it was really, yeah, it was an eye-opener to see that the topic of the Beijing Platform of Action is not so well known than we had thought. So I also informed my headquarters about it, and I really think it stimulated even more action from UN Women to make the good work of what has happened in Beijing 25 years ago more known. And a reason for which I'm really, really grateful, as I said, to IPFP to really make this event happen tonight. And I now have to just stand up to put the light on in my office. I'm really sorry for that. Okay. So here I'm back, and we have a quick presentation that my colleague Leah and I worked on. So we want to walk you through a few slides. So first slide. Yes, human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights. I think one of the most famous quotes from the conference that at that time Hillary Clinton stated. And the Beijing Declaration and Platform of Action was at that time, 25 years ago, endorsed by 189 governments. More than 17,000 participants attended. Really hard to imagine now that we are in the COVID-19 era. And there were 6,000 government delegates and 4,000 aggregate NGO representatives, and also the equal number of media representatives. It was a huge gathering. It really made a difference. And the Beijing Platform of Action was endorsed, and as we believe, it's still the most visionary agenda for the human rights of women and girls everywhere in the world. And we see the topics that were covered in the next slide. So it was 12 critical areas of concern that were discussed and agreed upon in Beijing. I will quickly read them because I think it's important to recall. Women and poverty, education and training of women, women and health, violence against women, women and armed conflict, and the economy, women in power and decision-making, institutional mechanisms for the advancement of women, human rights of women, women and the media, women and the environment, and the girl child. And when you go through these 12 critical areas of concern, you realize how far-reaching and visionary really that agenda was. There are, of course, certain areas which didn't get so much attention, such as climate change or digitalization, that would, of course, be much more upfront in today's world. But still, it was an excellent document, and we can still build on it, particularly because we have not fully implemented it. Next slide, please. In this context, I also want to say that the EU, of course, has taken up many of these areas in the work they are doing. I think with the new European Commission, we see a very strong commitment to gender equality. The EU gender equality strategy has been approved. The EU is working on its next gender action plan for external action. There is an EU strategic approach on women, peace and security, and a corresponding action plan, which also, I mean, really responds to the challenges of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 that Diana spoke about at the beginning. And we have a strong EU engagement for ending violence against women. We have the UN Spotlight Initiative, and the EU also has a strong commitment, of course, in the G7 and puts gender equality very much on the agenda there. So we pick up many of the areas that have been brought forward in Beijing, and we have here an actor who really wants to make a difference and who shares very much the same values on gender equality than UN Women. Next slide, please. So where are we now? What have we achieved? Where are the gaps? UN Women just recently published a new report, which really looks at an integrated approach to reporting on progress, gaps, and the challenges related to the advancement of gender equality and women's rights. And to ensure that progress is really moving forward and that it is achieved across all the themes that I have just spoken about, the report calls for 4 catalysts for change. 1, to support women's movements and leadership. This is extremely important. Secondly, to harness technology for gender equality, to bring in the new areas like digitalization, to ensure that no one is left behind and even the most marginalized women is being heard, and to match commitments with resources. And this last point I cannot underline sufficiently. If we have lots of plans, but we do not have the financial means to implement the plans, they are not worth much. Next slide, please. So the themes of the report is looking at 6 different areas. And it is also always related to the Sustainable Development Goals, our wonderful Agenda 2030 framework that also has gender equality as its centerpiece. So the 6 areas are inclusive development, shared prosperity, and decent work. Poverty eradication, social protection, and social services. Freedom from violence, stigma, and stereotypes. Next. Participation, accountability, and gender-responsive institutions, peaceful and inclusive societies, and lastly, but very importantly, environment conservation, climate action, and resilience building. So now let's see, where are we? What have we achieved? Where are the gaps? We have really very, very important gains to celebrate since the adoption of the Platform for Action. A few examples. 131 countries enacted 274 legal and regulatory reforms in support of gender equality. More girls are in school than ever before. Parity in education has been achieved on average at the global level, yet large gaps remain across and within countries. And maternal mortality is still too high, but has fallen by 38% between 2000 and 2017. These are some gains. However, there is still work to be done. Only 1 in 4 seats are held by women in national parliaments. That means that 3 in 4 seats are held by men. Globally, women aged 25 to 34 are 25% more likely than men to live in extreme poverty. The gender gap in labor force participation among adults aged 25 to 55 has stagnated over the past 20 years, standing at 31 percentage points. Gender parity in the workplace, still women are paid 16% less than men. And 18% of ever partnered women aged 15 to 49 experience sexual and or physical violence by an intimate partner in the previous 12 months. And unfortunately, this figure is very likely to have increased now to COVID-19 and the increase in domestic violence that we have seen everywhere. Next slide, please. There's a few more statistics. I just want to look at 2 here. The access to finance for women is still much less prominent than for men, and unpaid care and domestic work is still for women on average 3 times more than for men, which has, of course, very long-term consequences also for their labor engagement and income that they are receiving through paid labor. This is a huge issue. Next slide, please. So recommendations, I will quickly go that. Main recommendation is the extension of work-family reconciliation policies, such as paid parental leave, to workers in the informal economy, and investments in affordable early childhood education and care services. And this is particularly something that the EU is also very strongly looking into. Next recommendation, strengthening women's sexual and reproductive health and rights and better access to family planning. And third, new laws must be passed and implemented to stop all forms of violence against women, matched with properly funded and coordinated services for survivors. Support gender-responsive institutions, including national women's machineries, gender ministries, integrated across all levels of government, policies, planning, and budgets. We need much more discussions with finance ministers than we ever had before. Next slide, please, or next recommendation. More resources and funding for frontline women's organization for local peace building and humanitarian response. And last recommendation, transformative action to mitigate the consequences of the climate and environmental crisis. Women and girls must be a real part of that. And then I want to also share a few other recommendations stemming out of the Secretary General's report on Beijing Plus 25. I have already spoken about make the economy work for women. We need to accelerate the participation of women, including young women, in all levels of decision making. We need to harness the potential of technology for gender equality so we do not fall into the same trap than we have done on so many other sectors. We need to remove discriminatory laws and strengthen institutions for gender equality everywhere, and we need to close the data and evidence gaps. And I mentioned already the leave no one behind approach. And here, I might not go into the details of the next two slides, given our time limitations, but I'll be happy to share that through the organizers later. This is a timeline. What is going to happen with a girl born who is now 15 over the next 15 years if we really invest in gender equality? It's a very interesting timeline, and I can only recommend everybody to look at it at a later stage. So what are we doing? I mean, last year when I spoke about Beijing Plus 25, I already said we are really aiming high. We want to really shake the world on gender equality in 2020. Maybe it slowed down a bit to COVID-19. However, I think the movement is really strong and there. And we had aimed to have a Generation Equality Forum in Paris and Mexico. This will now only happen in 2021 to bring really the different players in society together. But we need a real refocus on multilateralism and women's human rights. We need to use the opportunity to galvanize action towards gender equality. And we really need to gather advocates from around the world to really call for action and to really, as I said, shake the agenda. So the Generation Equality Forum is an intergenerational and intersectional gathering for gender equality. It is convened by UN Women and co-chaired by France and Mexico. We don't know the dates. We had very exact dates for this year, but it is very likely to happen in the first quarter of 2021. I'll skip this slide now because of time, because I want to speak about the action coalitions. We have lots of things on paper. What we really need now is very concrete action coalitions. So we have agreed upon with stakeholders from all over the world on action coalitions that will be global, innovative, multi-stakeholder partnerships that will mobilize governments, civil society, international organizations, and the private sector to catalyze collective action for gender equality, to spark really a global and a local conversation among generations, to drive increased public and private investments, and to deliver very concrete game-changing results across generations for girls and women. And I hope you all want to be part of that exercise. There are 6 action coalition themes: ending gender-based violence, bodily autonomy and sexual and reproductive health and rights, economic justice and rights, feminist action for climate justice. So you see the new themes are emerging. technology and innovation for gender equality, and last but not least, feminist movements and leadership. And we have invited different stakeholders to join these action coalitions. The final selection is being finalized, and we will go public soon. And we have lots of exciting member states, international institutions, regional institutions to be in the lead of these different civil society in the lead of these different themes. The cross-cutting levers for the action coalitions are financing transforming gender, addressing norms, law and policy reform, education, gender data and accountability, addressing intersectional discrimination, and focusing on systematic change by addressing structural inequalities. So a very exciting agenda. And the centrality of adolescent girls and young women is key. Next slide, please. So we want to really have 2 to 3 priority actions to accelerate progress in the next 5 years. And one, as I mentioned, specifically on adolescent girls. And we really want only leaders who support these action coalitions who are really ready to make strong commitments, both political will, but also financial contributions. So the movers and shakers to really see progress within the next 5 years. Next slide, please. So how can you engage? And I'm going to stop with this. There's multiple forms to engage. And I think today's event is already one part of being engaged. You can follow the Generation Equality campaign that UN Women has launched. You can be supporting the action coalitions. You can join the Generation Equality Forum that is happening next year, but already start contributing to the debate now, engage people in the conversation on gender equality, and really make a difference and really join the movement to finally achieve gender equality in all countries of this world. Because I want to just mention one more time, so far, not one single country in the world has achieved gender equality, and that's really not good if I think that we are in the year 2020. Thank you so much, and I look forward to hearing the next contributions of the next speakers and then to engage with all of you in the discussion.
Dagmar, thank you very much. That was excellent. It gave us really a thorough overview on where we are with the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, where we're falling behind, and the areas, the new areas that we need to focus on, including technology and innovation. I'm sure you've received a lot of questions. I've asked the participants to already start thinking about the questions they like to ask, and then we'll manage that after the other speakers have spoken. So let's move on with the second speaker, who is Jakub. Jakub will cover the, I see that he's already putting the slides on. We can see that, okay. Jakub will cover a little bit from Dagmar, who's talked about a more horizontal, like global perspective. Jakub will cover the European perspective a little bit more, based also on the latest report released by the European Institute for Gender Equality. So I would ask Jakub, what are the major trends in Europe? Which are the areas in Europe and in which Europe is falling behind? Where are the success stories? And of course, like as we discussed, if you could give a particular focus to women in the environment, women in the media, and women in health, especially related to the COVID-19 health emergency, and of course, women in defense and security. Jakub, you have the floor. You have to unmute.
Okay, thank you very much. I will just put my slides on now. Yeah, do you see the slides?
We can see everything.
Perfect. Perfect. Then thank you very much for the opportunity to speak at this exciting event. And indeed, as you said, I will cover a bit more specific region within the context of Beijing Platform for Action, which was so nicely introduced by the previous presentation and presented in broader context. So I will look at the review of progress towards women's empowerment, specifically in the European Union, as the European Institute for Gender Equality is responsible for carrying out periodic reviews of the Beijing platform and the progress towards women's empowerment in this context. So just to give a very brief introduction before I move into the trends. So we are now 25 years after the adoption of Beijing, and this review covers the progress towards gender empowerment across all areas of concern identified in the Beijing platform since 2013, when last such a review was carried out. The reviews are carried out in 5 years intervals. So the scope is quite broad, and what I'm going to present here today is quite selective in a way. Given the breadth of the review, we have to select particular findings with emphasis on emerging challenges. So I also encourage you to check out the whole report, which has much more comprehensive coverage. But without further delay, I'm going to move to the first topic that I want to cover, which is actually a more long-standing one. So the inequalities in the labor market. So the EU labor market is characterized by a number of persistent economic inequalities, starting with lower participation in employment by around 11 percentage points, going through lower women who face around 16% of pay gap compared to men, going through also segregation of the labor market, which means that there are some women-dominated fields and some men-dominated fields, and women in particular are missing out on some of the most well-paid jobs and jobs that have high prospects looking forward to the future. So for example, when we look at the ICT and STEM sector, we see that only 17% of ICT professionals in the EU at the moment are women. Now, lots of these inequalities in the EU labor market are underpinned by unequal distribution of unpaid work in households, where by unpaid work we mean, for example, childcare, care for other dependent relatives, housework, and so on. So the degree to which women are held back by their disproportionate share of unpaid work can be illustrated on a couple of statistics. So for example, we saw that 8 million of women compared to 500,000 of men are not working due to care responsibilities. Around 9 million of women are working only part-time due to caring responsibilities compared to 500,000 of men. I will stop here. I will stop here a little bit to have a look at the recent COVID crisis and some implications for the inequalities in the labor market. This was not covered by the review itself since it was carried before, but we have at EGE we have carried out some other research on this, so we have some initial information. So we have seen some of these economic inequalities to come into limelight in the light of the COVID pandemic. So we have seen the disproportionate share of unpaid work and particularly care to come into limelight due to the school closures and childcare facilities closures that were part of the response measures to COVID, which meant that lots of care work that was externalized previously suddenly moved back home, and this seems to have affected particularly women who undertake the major share of this work. And in particular, it has affected some groups of women disproportionately, such as lone mothers, who have been particularly exposed to these pressures of combining a sudden influx of care and employment, and may have lost employment in many cases. Other inequality it worked. This was tried in some professions that across many member states are low paid, such as nurses, but were declared essential and faced all of these challenges. So now I will move on with the presentation, coming back to the Beijing review, and spend
Jakub?
move on with the presentation, coming back to the Beijing on the care, childcare arrangements in the EU, and care arrangements are seen as some of the key tools can enable better work-life flow.
Jakub, could you please adjust your connection, because we hear you when we don't hear you well.
Okay, can you hear me better?
Yes, now it's better.
Yeah,
Everyone
it's better.
has
Okay. Still, so is it okay now? Can I continue talking? Hello, because I don't hear either now.
Yes, you can. Yeah, now we hear you definitely. Yeah. Yes, please.
Better. Okay, perfect. Then let me get back. Okay, so as I was saying, the work-life balance measures and care policies are seen as one of the key potentials to improve work-life balance of both women and men, and perhaps shift the distribution of unpaid work. In this context, we have seen some positive progress in the EU over the past 5 years, where a number of member states have improved availability and affordability of childcare. We have also seen the Work-Life Balance Directive being adopted. Hello, because I don't hear now. Implements to parental leaves, flexible working arrangements, and encouraging men to take these. Similarly, member states have also often improved availability of parental leaves. So we have seen some progress in this area. But there is still a lot left to be done, demonstrated by some of the figures that you see on the screen. So 1 in 6 households in the EU currently have unmet needs for child. Services with lots of variation, more urgent for long-term care, professional home care services, which is aging profile of the EU population. Topic. Another important topic.
Jakub, sorry to interrupt.
So, as I was saying, the work-life balance are seen as one of the women and men, and perhaps
Okay, apparently. So everybody, I think, can hear me now. I think we have a problem with Jakub, and what we will do, we'll resume the discussion with Jakub afterwards. I think he has a connection issue that I'm not sure he'll be able to solve right now. He might need to move somewhere else. So what I would do, Serap, I see her already connected. So Serap, if you can hear me, everybody can hear me good. Okay, I see your video on now. Perfect. Serap, we'll move on to you. to address actually the more peace, conflict, crisis development perspectives, because you at Plan International do a lot of work on this, especially in gender equality, and with examples also from the field related to the persistence of course, gender-based violence, FGM, child marriage, child prostitution, and all the cultural and religious and societal stereotypes and norms that have actually a gender dimension. You wanted to bring up also the voices from the Sahel study that you have done and other related examples you deem appropriate. So Serap, the floor is yours, and thank you very much again for participating.
Thank you, Diana, and YPFP for your welcome and organizing this opportunity to learn from each other, motivate each other, and strengthen, and of course, renew our push for gender equality. Also, first of all, of course, thank you to the previous speakers, Dagmar, and we could also hear, I think, very good insights from Jakub, where we are at in terms of gender equality. And we all certainly agree this is far behind where we want to be. And finally, thank you to our audience and participants of dedicated and engaged young people interested in pushing for change and gender equality. It's really a privilege to be speaking to you tonight. Empowering young people is a value very close to my heart and key in particular to our work at Plan International. So I would firstly like to introduce myself. I'm a proud and passionate intersectional feminist and activist more than 30 years now. My roles currently at Plan International, but in the past at the European Women's Lobby, the European Network Against Racism, and at Terre de Femmes, show my lifelong personal commitment to girls' rights, young women, and gender equality. And as someone from a non-white ethnic background, my fight against racism and discrimination of all forms has also guided me throughout my work. I think recent events have provided a much needed wake-up call in our sector, and I hope anti-racist thinking can also be developed further and strengthened in our sector. I strongly believe that feminism is only a feminism when it is intersectional, and I wholeheartedly stand by these values in both my personal and professional life. One of the greatest privileges of my job is being able to share a platform and workplace with girls and women who have the most incredible strengths and have overcome such adversities and challenges. We must amplify these girls and young women and enable environments where they can unlock their potential to make the world a better place. I strongly believe it is our role as NGOs, think tanks, or the UN to let the communities we serve and their lived experience guide us. And I also wanted to share that during my time at Terre de Femmes in Germany, I proudly remember advocating for the creation of UN Women for the new opportunities it would provide to support feminist activists and open international spaces for grassroots organizations. I hope we can collectively renew our efforts to amplify grassroots and local organizations and trust them to guide us in our work. 25 years on from the Beijing Declaration, and we are still a long way from achieving gender equality. The 12 critical action areas still remain critical. Less progress has been made than might have been hoped for, and this is particularly relevant for girls and adolescent girls. Gender inequality is entrenched, enshrined, and institutionalized in our societies. But this does not excuse our lack of progress, and instead it should motivate us to push harder and stronger. It is also for this reason that a life cycle approach is essential. In 1995, girls and girls' rights were largely absent from discussions, but without transforming girls' lives and tearing down the social norms and power structures that limit them, with the help of men and allies, we can never hope to achieve gender equality. Now more than ever, with COVID-19 exacerbating institutional inequalities, girls' rights are being threatened, as was acknowledged by the Executive Director of UN Women as well. A recent event, she was exactly talking on girls' education, hosted by the Government of Ireland. Beijing Plus 25 is a critical opportunity to raise girls' rights issues up the agenda, and as such, they must remain at the center of the action coalitions, which is the mechanism to ensure meaningful action on girls' and women's rights in the coming years. Together with UN Women and other stakeholders, including partners in the Adolescent Girls Investment Plan Group, we have made some strong gains in ensuring girls' rights are included in Beijing Plus 25 agenda. However, COVID-19 has led huge shifts in our ways of working and organizing, and we urge the Beijing Plus 25 leadership to ensure that at this critical juncture, these gains do not slip in the efforts to re-strategize and organize under the generation equality agenda. Adolescence is a critical period of great transition for girls. It is a unique window when life-changing events happen and offers a distinct opportunity to break cycles of poverty and deprivation. However, for girls, early adolescence is typically a period where their worlds shrink and opportunities are curtailed due to norms and expectations of their social environments. Their mobility becomes limited to protect their sexual purity and family honor. They take on care and domestic work, drop out of school, abandon their friendship and networks, and may be forced into marriage. The double discrimination they face due to their sex, gender, and age is compounded by poverty and other factors of discrimination, such as disability, sexual identity, or, for example, ethnicity. Often, they enter adulthood already at a severe disadvantage as a result of violence, early pregnancy, child marriage, and limited opportunities for education and employment. This is why our work must be led by youth voices. Plan International, with Adolescent Girl Investment Plan partners, have held several dialogues with young people from more than 100 girl and youth-led organizations. We are collating the findings, and we will use these to further develop our strategy to amplify girls' voices and support girl-led organizations in the generation equality process. We are also updating the initial findings of consultations done in February, March with girls across 11 countries to understand their priorities in terms of fulfilling the Beijing Platform for Action in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. Youth are powerful, and their voices and perspective must be at the center. We must trust in communities and, importantly, in adolescent girls and young women, in their thought leadership, in their capabilities, and in their lived experience to lead change. And this is true in every corner of the world. Beijing Plus 25 must also consider those voices we very rarely hear. And we want every action coalition to be relevant to conflict settings to protect and empower the most vulnerable. Having also heard now, so to say, the international perspective, and a little bit we could hear from Jakub from the European perspective, I would like now to transport us to Sahel, guided by the voices of the girls who live there. The Sahel region is a prime example of setting where girls distinct and unique, where they are facing distinct and unique challenges. I would like to share with you some stories from the girls and adolescent girls in the Sahel region. Plan International's latest report is centering girls' voices and shows how essential it is that we listen to this group, and that it is only by listening to their voices and letting them lead that we can bring about long-lasting change. In the past months, we in the humanitarian aid and development sector have had some much needed wake-up calls. And the Sahel region knows these issues, structural inequalities, well. The Sahel crisis is complex. Since 2016, the number of attacks has increased fivefold in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. All three states are coping with the lowest human development and gender equality indices, and are regions affected by lack of governance, structural poverty, and an increasing loss of agricultural resources, which are the occupation of 80% of women and girls in Africa. In such contexts, adolescent girls face distinct and unique challenges because of their age and gender. Commissioner Lenarčič shares the opinion of UN Women Executive Director, recently saying in our launch webinar on the report, girls' voices are of key relevance to us. He said he believes in a holistic approach to respond to the interconnected problems that they are facing. Therefore, achieving resilience of adolescent girls can only happen by listening to them. Plan International has worked for more than 40 years now in these regions to ensure that our responses in Sahel will prioritize girls and young women's resilience. Resilience means not only enabling, but also providing the elements someone needs to actually thrive in difficult situations. You were saying, for example, that we all could join the equality, the generation equality fora. However, I think we also have to be very conscious that not everyone can join. We also have to see how do we really enable those girls, young women, to contribute also to the change that we want to see across the world. Resilience, as I said, therefore must be also core in the future, and in particular in the action coalition circles. So what we do is therefore using a life cycle approach, and our emergency plan seeks to protect children and youth by prioritizing child protection emergencies, for example, education emergencies, youth and economic empowerment emergencies, sexual reproductive health and rights, among others. COVID-19 is multiplying these risks, highlighting systemic, deep-rooted inequalities. As of Sunday, that means 2 days ago, the pandemic has reached over 4,000 confirmed cases in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, where the health systems of the crisis-affected areas are very weak or inexistent. It is impossible to recover unless we build resilience. Yet, it is not just the pandemic preventing girls' access to their rights. According to a 14-year-old girl in Mali, people here don't like that we go to school. They give us in marriage at the earliest age. As in our report on the Sahel, across all areas of the Beijing Platform for Action Girls, persistently called for accelerated efforts to challenge the norms and structures that sustain and reproduce gender stereotypes and prejudices. Girls are frustrated at the pace of change relating to the traditional gender roles and norms that continue to curtail their ambitions and limit their horizons, and that threaten their safety. If interventions are not based on the lived experience of girls and women, if Beijing Plus 25 discussions do not center girls and young women voices with the involvement of local communities, the same structures of oppression will continue. Gender roles will be continually reinforced, and it will be impossible to achieve long-lasting change, stability, and peace building in the region. For this reason, the action coalitions for Beijing Plus 25 should enable opportunities for adolescent girls and young women, not only to contribute, but also to lead. We must aim to go beyond survival to being able to thrive. A 15-year-old girl from Mali who has lived half her life in a region affected by violence says, "I'm sad because I was chased from my home by force by the terrorists." Building peace is the priority of girls in the Sahel, as we also discovered in our consultations with girls for Beijing Plus 25. Violence not only outside, but also in the home means girls live in fear. Gender-based violence was identified as the top priority issue across all consultations. Participants also described GBV as being tied to and predetermining all other development outcomes for adolescent girls. They live in fear of violence, of being married off, of not being able to leave the house and being excluded to household chores, of not being able to work on their future and go to school or even able to make a living. Girls are actors of change. They know what it is to be done to bring lasting peace, equality, and inclusive development to the region. We must build girls' resilience by applying a holistic approach, linking also, if it comes to the future work in the Action Coalition circles, humanitarian and development work, linking them to ensure shocks and stresses do not erode development gains, trap people in cycles of poverty, and reverse progress on gender equality. Fragile and protected crises have seen continual development and aid without success. A lack of localization also perpetuates neocolonial power dynamics of aid, something we as Plan International had to learn ourselves from our own community-based programs. In these crises, systemic gender discrimination, entrenched gender stereotypes, and gendered power dynamics are exacerbated, meaning increased threats to the bodily autonomy, safety, and well-being of girls, as also highlighted as a key issue by the girls themselves in the Girls in Crisis report of Plan International. Plan International's history is rooted in the communities we serve, from our origins in the Spanish Civil War, more than 80 years ago. Now is the time to remember our proud history, step up our efforts and push for long-lasting change, lead by communities, as well acknowledging and appreciating first responders, encouraging, of course, multilateral agencies such as the UN, but also the EU to do the same. Beijing +25 is an incredible opportunity to bring about transformative and long-lasting change. But if this is not driven by the voices of the most marginalized, we will merely continue to perpetuate the same unequal power structures. I think now is the time to put our trust in the lived experiences of girls and young women across the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Serap, for this really heartfelt intervention. We really appreciated your perspective, especially from the field. And I'm sure there's already, I can see some questions on the chat that I will definitely forward afterwards, so we can open the debate also for the questions. But before that, I wanted to check if Jakub is online to finish his presentation and then move to Fleur, because
okay, I'm here.
You're here, yeah, perfect. I think we have until 8:30, so we have enough time, but yes, we need to also open the floor for questions. So keeping that in mind, Jakub, I'll give you the floor again so you can definitely pick up from where you left.
And where I left was where, because I'm not entirely sure where I dropped off. So if you remember which slide I was on at that point.
Slide number 4, as far as I remember.
So it was on decision making?
Yes, I think it was that one. If you could put it on, I remember.
Yeah. Was it this one?
I can't see it currently, but
I think I need to maybe, sorry, I might need to reshare the screen again, I guess. Yes. Entire screen allow. Yep. Okay. Can you see my screen now?
we can see it. Yes, actually.
And the slide was this one?
Government action can bring about change. You were moving to this one, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So if I was moving to this one, then I will start quickly here. So as the underrepresentation of women in decision making is actually a systemic issue that applies across different areas of life. women almost in all areas account for less than 40% decision makers, and in some areas in particular, such as in certain economic and business decision-making positions, they account for less than 20% of decision makers. Now, what I want to highlight here is that targeted action can bring about changes and can change this. So when we look, for example, at member states that adopting binding quotas for share of women on company boards, we see that the proportion of women on company boards has increased from about 18% to around 35% over the period of 2013 to 2020. When we look at countries that adopted soft measures, we also see some progress, whereas where we look at countries that adopted no measures, we see that they are starkly stuck at 15% of women on company board, of share of company of women on company boards. Now, there is a range of causes behind the underrepresentation of women in decision making, and here I'm going to talk in more detail about one, which is the gender-based violence and harassment against women. This is a widespread issue in EU societies. We see that around 1 in 3, 1 in 2 has experienced such violence from an intimate partner, and around half of European women has experienced sexual harassment. And obviously, in light of the recent COVID crisis, there's been reports of violence spiking up. So these rates may increase these rates may increase. Now, what I want to talk about more here is the new forms of violence emerging in the digital age, which are used to silence women in public positions and in public places. So in this, I'm going to just quote a couple of statistics here on this. So in our research, we found that around 80% of women parliamentarians experience psychological violence worldwide, and around 40% of them has had and extremely humiliating or sexually charged images of them shared on social media. We have also seen that around 1 in 5 young women in the EU are affected by sexual cyber harassment, such as cyberstalking, cyberbullying, impersonation, and so on. And this has important effects for their participation in public debates. So in this context, we have seen that around half of young women hesitate to engage in social media due to fears of abuse. And perhaps one more example here relates to journalists, where we have seen that around 40% of women journalists report that they self-censor themselves after episodes of online abuse. Now, this is a problem for men as well, but for women there is an added layer of gender-based violence in this with sexual connotations. So due to fears. So I think that kind of wraps up my presentation of challenges. So I just to wrap it up quickly, I would like to say that what our review has shown is that there is still a number of persistent challenges that's been around for a long time that are not resolved and are being resolved at a very slow pace. There has been some progress, but on the other hand, there is also a number of new challenges emerging in context of digitalization, migration, and environmental policy. So indeed, there is a lot to be done in the future to reach gender equality and to implement the Beijing Platform agenda for action.
Jakub, thank you very much for the numbers on the European horizon. I'm sure there's already some questions for you on the chat, but I would quickly move to Fleur.
Presentation of challenges. So what our review has shown is that there is still enough time that are not resolved and are being resolved. But on the other hand, there is also a number of new challenges in environmental policy. So indeed,
I think Fleur can hear me. You are muted. Jakub was wrapping up, but we have the usual issue with the connection. I think is just in the wrong place. Fleur, thank you so much. Last but not least, for participating in this debate. Fleur is the head of Gender and Inclusive Security at the GCSP, as I actually introduced her at the beginning. And Fleur will focus on gender and inclusive security, and especially on the tools and the strategies to promote a greater representation of women in society, in politics, and the economy. And I've seen a question on this in the chat, which might be directly for you. And the relationship between gender, the leadership styles, and security outcomes. So Fleur, thank you very much again, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So can you see my screen? That's the first question.
We can.
Okay, wonderful. So thank you so much for this introduction and opportunity, and appreciate the technical challenges. We've had a few ourselves with webinars, so more than happy to bear with you on this. So I'm Fleur Heyworth, as mentioned, and I hope to be able to share some insights that we've gained over the last few years, particularly working in education and policy. I represent the Geneva Centre for Security Policy here today, where we have a number of activities, all in support of international cooperation, peace and security. So I'm responsible for our Inspiring Women Leaders courses, as well as courses to foster more gender equitable societies and policies, and I'm also responsible for the International Gender Champions Secretariat, which is being incubated in our Creative Spark. So I look forward to being able to share some insights that I've gained through that role as well. So in terms of what I suggest the solutions are, I'm going to start with that. There's many, and the speakers before me have articulated how in-depth and comprehensive we need to be in moving from the policies to the action, and the action is the buzzword of the Beijing 25 anniversary. So this is not complete, but it does share some perspectives, and I would already reiterate the need for gender disaggregated data to help us to get a better picture of this from the start. So the first thing I'm going to look at is developing your mindset and awareness to see the barriers and recognise both the problems that we have in advancing gender equality, which may have some technical solutions, but also to see those challenges which are actually tensions or polarities, which simply aren't going to go away, and we need to learn to navigate better. Secondly, I'm going to be talking about engaging women and men to shift norms, both at home and in the workplace. And this also involves revaluing care, community and the environment. And we've already heard so much from UN Women and from the European Institute for Gender Justice about unpaid care work. And that's coming up time and again as an absolutely critical barrier that needs to be overcome. And then thirdly, I'm going to look at the networks of support and accountability that I think are part of that movement building that UN Women have identified. And I'll share the example of the IGC, but I also think there needs to be at all levels. I was working last week with the Mediterranean Women Mediators Network, and those networks in every space are necessary for that support, inspiration and exchange. And then finally, I will share some thoughts on leadership and security outcomes. I'm very aware that there are many different views on this, so I hope not to polarise them further. And I'm sure members of the community participating will have some thoughts as well. So where should we start? I'd like to start with a quote by Anais Nin on our mindset and how we actually perceive the challenges of gender equality. And she says, "We do not see things as they are, we see them as we are." I think all of this starts by acknowledging our own positionality. I acknowledge mine as somebody who's been fortunate enough to have a high quality of education and financial stability to enable me to progress. I've also had childcare challenges myself, having taken an extended maternity leave due to the difficulty of balancing work and life. But I don't see the intersectional discrimination in the same way others do. And I think that's been brought to the fore with COVID recently. In Geneva, we had many people out on the streets queuing for food parcels who were hidden in the economy and in our societies. And as Dagmar's just mentioned on behalf of Plan International, we know that in underdeveloped regions and in conflict zones and humanitarian settings, we're only just getting a grasp, a sense of the impact that COVID and other crises are going to have. So there are some dangerous assumptions that I make. I ask you to forgive me for any you spot, but I would also invite us to use this opportunity, like you're having this webinar, to engage in dialogue. We can acknowledge our privilege, as Michael Kimmel indicates that we should do, and recognise that we don't necessarily see things that we have the privilege to experience. We don't see the inequalities, but we have to start this discussion. And I'm really excited in the year ahead to see what the youth in particular are going to bring and make sure that these voices come to the fore through the generation equality coalitions and forums that are being hosted. So I'd just like to spend a few moments, because so much of gender equality and inequality is systemic, it's structural, and it's embedded and layered over time. And I just want to spend a few moments just taking us back to where we've come from. If you think of the right to vote, we're less than 100 years from that for many countries. And this isn't in any way an excuse. But when you look at the Beijing Platform for Action, that was a landmark. And then in 2000, we had the resolution 1325 on women, peace and security, and the many subsequent resolutions which have sought to ensure that women are participating, that they are represented, that there is adequate protection, relief and recovery, and that we know we're really not there yet. And so when we think of what's moved us forward and pushed us back, we know that we've had these women movements and marches, and the Me Too campaign was a big catalyst, but at the same time, we've seen resistance, we've seen backlash, we've seen all the issues that Dagmar's highlighted around female genital mutilation, domestic violence, sexual and gender-based violence in conflict, forced marriage, and there's policies such as the global gag around abortion and funding from the US. The Human Rights Council is a battlefield over women's bodies, and the language that can be used in relation to their rights and their bodies. So this is by no means a simple problem to solve. There are strong views on both sides of these issues. And so we've got both these tensions, we've got these systemic challenges, and then we're also seeing with AI that there is a flip side to the benefits of the data, in that the discrimination, the biases that we have are actually becoming embedded in our systems. And we're seeing that the algorithms and the problems that we have in our human judgment, our human biases, are becoming embedded in our systems. And so we really need to start seeing these and redesigning better. So going back to you as an individual, and what can you do? Well, and where are these stereotypes coming from? And we talk about bias, it's a really difficult topic. There's mixed outcomes when we have bias training. For some people, it helps them to see the new challenges and the discrimination around them. For others, it actually worsens the perceptions and the behaviour. So there's no quick fixes to this, but I think, like the AI being embedded, we have to see how the language we use and the perceptions we have that are gendered and discriminatory are embedded in our systems, our structures, and also our images. So I'll give you this example. If you Google cartoon professor, of the first 100 images on Google, how many do you think are women and how are they represented? And if we then start looking at the roles that we're playing in society and what norms they're feeding into, this feeds into the male leader, knowledge producer in the public space, and women left with the caring roles, which we know that they are. And so one of my first things to say is, in terms of our mindsets, we need to look out for this. And we also need to try and develop new images, new ways of articulating what the positive vision should look like. And I use this example of the baby changing station. I'd love to hear from many participants what it's like in your city in terms of access to these opportunities, access to these facilities in our roads, in our buildings, and how they're represented. So I've got a question for you in terms of these biases and in terms of these perceptions. Be really grateful just to spend a couple of minutes in chat with you answering these questions. What percentage of men showed at least one clear bias against gender equality in areas such as politics, economics, education, intimate partner violence, and women's reproductive rights? And the same question of the women. So would anyone like to share that in chat? Don't be afraid. We might normally do a poll. 91%, 23%, 72%, 91%, 91%. So you're right on the men, highest in both cases. You're absolutely right. This was a recent World Values Survey, and it concluded that it's really at the top end for both men and women. And this feeds into leadership, it feeds into the way we perceive economic rights, educational rights. Give you an example of the questions that are asked. Political, men make better political leaders than women do. Strongly agree, agree, disagree, or strongly disagree. And the bias definition was around strongly agree and agree. And then you can see the questions hopefully for yourself. I won't read through them all, but we need to start taking really positive steps to overcome this. And as my previous speakers have indicated, it's about getting to new norms. And we know from the research by the UN Human Development Perspectives, and it's reiterated by ILO, and I'm sure many other agencies, that for many people, we've got to this level of basic capability where there's subsistence and a basic level of participation. But the enhanced capabilities, where there's really this power shift around the agency and change, that is lacking. That's where the gap is. And it doesn't take much to see the figures. We know, many of you will know them around politics, around employment, around wealth. And so, as has already been identified, we need to shift those care norms. And when we think of when we think of the different topics that you're concerned with, it applies at every single level of society. So when I was running this course last week with women mediators, one of the participants said, before COVID, I was juggling my work, my voluntary peace work to be part of this network, and my childcare. And the elastic band was stretched like this. With COVID, it is snapping. I simply am running out of energy, I'm running out of time, and I can't sustain this engagement in all these different levels. So we're asking women to step up. We're asking women to participate. But if we don't address these fundamental norms and barriers in everyday life, then we're holding women back and we're holding progress back. The often unaddressed aspect of this is around masculinity. And changing attitudes towards care as being deemed to be the priority by OECD and others, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development. But there's a wide acknowledgement that public policies are not really there yet, that we have so much more to do. My view is that care should be part of the infrastructure, like the roads and railways, that it really needs to be embedded that deeply, and that we also need to revalue, as I said right at the start, that care work, and that's reiterated by many leaders. So I've talked about some of these as being problems to solve and some of these being tensions to leverage. What do I mean? So some of the laws, some of us may be focusing on laws and policies, and that's absolutely right. We need to be improving the laws and policies and making progress on those. But in achieving gender equality, I would say that we also need to pay attention to the hearts and minds if we're going to overcome the resistance and the backlash. So we have many of these strategies in place, and Beijing +25, I should have put in here, is one of those, which sets out these really comprehensive roadmaps. But we also need to have this empathy, this compassion for men and women in understanding where they're coming from, and in shifting these mindsets. It's not just men that are biased against women, it's women that are biased against women as well. And so I've just picked up the UN high-level panel on economic development, where they picked up on many of the aspects that need to change around business practice, procurement, tackling these adverse norms and discriminatory laws, recognising and reducing unpaid work and care, building assets, digital, financial and property, strengthening visibility, voice and representation. And see many of these themes carried forward in the UN Women Beijing +25 work. But essentially my point around all of this is we need to see the technical problems where we just need to work hard at the solutions, and the areas where we need to adapt. We need to check in, we need to see what's happening, and we need to adapt so that we bring others with us. We need to think systemically and have this positive vision. Nobody is going to buy into a vision which is always in the negative. It's that classic, if I tell you not to imagine a big purple elephant, what have you got in your brain right now? We need to be able to think positively about the future we want to create. And so this leads me on to the third point I made, which was around developing networks at all levels. And I mentioned the women's networks, which I think are really powerful. And now I'd like to share with you just briefly what the International Gender Champions have been doing. We don't have a Brussels chapter. One has been talked about, but it's not quite got off the ground for various different reasons. And I can talk about that in the Q&A if helpful. So what is it? It's a network of leaders. They're all heads of their organisations committed to working together to break down gender barriers. We have now over 400, so 270 active, and the rest are alumni. And it's bringing together international organisations, CEOs, ambassadors, and leaders of civil society. We founded in Geneva 5 years ago. It's our anniversary this week, and we're now in 5 other multilateral hubs, which you can see on the map of New York, Vienna, Den Haag, Nairobi, and recently Paris. And so how are they shifting norms? The first thing was that they made a panel parity pledge, a core commitment of all leaders, and it's shown results. It's not been easy for many people to do, but it started to shift perceptions, create a space for conversations where people can question whether an all-male panel is acceptable anymore, and it shouldn't be. And so that's been one pillar. And then the other is these personalised smart commitments. And when I started with us as individuals and our perceptions. And I really think that if we're to move forward with gender equality, it begins with each of us. at all levels in our homes, in our workplaces, and in our communities, that we have to, in our sphere of influence, make the changes that we can. And sometimes that's at this high level where we see action around good governance, leadership and accountability, recruitment practices, work-life balance, organisational culture, meetings, conferences and delegations, programmatic and field work. But when I do my women's leadership work, it's also commitments to ourselves and in our homes, and sometimes negotiating those difficult conversations around who picks up the children tonight, you know, making commitments to ourselves that we're going to try and make a difference. One area I'd like to just focus on is we have impact groups in different areas, from justice and disarmament to representation and standards. I mentioned the new norms. We're really trying to shift new norms, and the one that we're focusing now is around inclusive and enabling environments. And I think particularly in workplaces, this is key. We are actually launching with UN Women a parental leave campaign, and we have a number of heads, 17 now, who have all sent us videos saying, I support parental leave, and having these people role model those messages and really speak publicly, I think is an important aspect of creating change and catalysing it more broadly within the system. So these are the other aspects of our core values I think we need to have better conversations about in our workplaces, particularly generating those safe workplaces. I know this isn't all values, but it's the ones we've adopted. So I've got a few minutes, I hope, Diana. Final thoughts on leadership and security outcomes. As I mentioned, this is a thorny topic. I hope to be able to share something that isn't too controversial. I think, first of all, that COVID has shown us different ways of doing things. I think it's shown us, first of all, that security isn't just associated with military security, but it's shifted our perceptions to human security, to each individual's health and rights and freedoms. And so that has been a start in the narrative, recognising it's not just about protecting our borders and violent conflict, although that's still an issue, but we also need to think about how we're generating security outcomes for individuals within our populations. It's also highlighted, COVID has also highlighted that there are hidden security challenges, and domestic violence, as has already been mentioned, is largely hidden from sight. And it's hopefully opened up a space to get better prevention policies on it. And then finally, we see that we're recognising more and more the disproportionate social and economic outcomes on women, even if fewer women are dying from the morbidity of the virus itself. The responses to COVID and previous pandemics shows that if we divert resources away from women's health and rights and needs, then they will die from other causes, whether it's childbirth or maternal mortality. And so I think we're seeing a shift in security outcomes here. And so you're hearing my children going to bed, so I hope it's not too disruptive. This is real, so apologies for that. Okay, so I mentioned that COVID has exacerbated economic inequalities. Women are amongst the most vulnerable and insecure. And what we're seeing with the leadership as well is that women are just not represented in this response in the way that they should be. And Women in Global Health have very helpfully captured this in visualised form around senior leaders, a task force, and who is quoted, who is in the media. We've seen many headlines like this, I'm sure, of women having more effective responses. There are also countries led by men that have had effective responses. I think we need to look beyond the binary, but what I would say is that I think it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, in that which are the countries which have allowed those female leaders to rise up, and what kind of environments and social cultures do they have which has supported their progress. Is it that the society is also more open to these diverse viewpoints and enabling women to rise up, as well as the women's leadership itself? So I think that we need to recognise both sides of this. I do think that we need to have a better focus on building trust. Inequality is undermining it. This is Edelman's Trust Barometer. Jacinda Ardern appeared on the front before she responded to COVID as somebody demonstrating competence and ethics. But I would also, from a women's leadership point of view, talk to her fresh style of communication, which is compassionate and which is not all formal, it's informal, and many other attributes she has. And so to conclude, my final takeaway from this is shifting from either or polarizing views to both and. This means looking at masculine and feminine, state security and human security, directive leadership and participative leadership, local and national and regional and international action. We need it all. And so at the Geneva Centre for Security Policy, we're working with the Centre for Creative Leadership. And I know there's a colleague on the call who's from there to try and develop these tools and strategies to help us to progress. And we work with people like Polarity Partners who try to help us to see these tensions and shift them into more positive outcomes. That's it from me. Thanks.
Fleur, thank you very much, really, for your great intervention, and you gave us a lot of insights to look at gender equality in a different light. I would like now to move to the questions, and I have two questions from for Dagmar, actually, which have been submitted via the chat, and Dagmar are all, of course, like tackling the financial aspects, because you said, and you mentioned that we need the financial means to implement the plans. Without those plans remain only on paper, how do we secure this financial means, and who needs to do what? And this is from Cristiana Badulescu. And then we have a similar question from Marion Ross, always focused on funding. Could you please speak a bit more about the gap between what policymakers commit to and what funding authorities actually implement? We see a lot of good initiatives from the EU as a donor, requesting gender mainstreaming throughout projects, but then when it comes to spending the extra euro, they're very hesitant. So Dagmar, that's all for you and from your experience as UN Women head of the Brussels office.
Thank you so much. And yeah, thank you also so much for the inspiring presentations by the other panelists. It was really enjoyable to listen to everybody. And I'm also following the questions in the chat, and really interesting questions on China, engagement of men and aerospace industry. So I'm really looking forward to the debate. But coming back to the question you just read to me, Diana, it is a key issue. I just underline again, I mean, we can have all plans in the world. If they are not funded, we are not going to achieve what we need to achieve. How do we get there? It's definitely tremendous advocacy we all have to do together. I also mentioned already a much stronger engagement with ministers of finance. We sometimes tend on gender equality engage in the discussions with the ministers for gender equality, which of course is very important. You have to have the contact and you have to work with the gender ministers. At the same time, you also need to work with the finance ministers. I think this is something we could all do even more. And I think the Beijing Plus 25 opportunity is a good moment to intensify those discussions. The EU currently has a great opportunity as its fingertip. The next multi-annual financial framework is about to be negotiated and come to a conclusion at the end of the year, if all goes well. The German presidency has a very strong task at its hand right now. And there, of course, we also have to make sure there is specific allocations for gender equality. And here I want to come back to what you just said, Diana, about the programs and also the activities that the EU funds in external action. We need a very gender responsive budgeting process where we really need to go budget line by budget line and discuss what is the impact for women, what is the impact for men, and how can we ensure that we fund women's organizations, women local organizations, but also look at the policy of trade, at the policy of agriculture to really see what are the gender impacts. So it is, we have a lot of tools for that. There are countries who have done tremendous work in this respect. I mean, I am naming just Austria and Finland here, who have really been forerunners on the topic. And we just have to do this as a serious business. And with regard to development projects, I mean, we very often talk about mainstreaming and how important it is to have gender equality mainstreamed in all projects. Yes, for sure. But unless we have also targeted funding for women only or for gender only projects, we are not going to achieve what we want to achieve.
Thank you, Dagmar, for the very candid answer. Unfortunately, this has always been an issue in enhancing, like, concretely, then promoting gender equality with concrete actions. I hope after COVID-19 and with the German presidency, situation will change. We will monitor this, hopefully. Thank you very much. I have some other questions. I think there is one that, mindful of time, actually, because we need to finish on time at 8:30. Of course, because all of you want to go for dinner and have a private life. So I don't want to hold you here for forever. But I would like to pick up a lot of the questions that were asked. So what there's a question from Pasquale Vitale. I think it's from Fleur mainly. Pasquale says, working since years in the aerospace industry where gender diversity is not at the top of the agenda and women are almost absent from top management boards, could you please suggest some concrete actions we can all take to promote gender equality in a male-centered environment?
Thanks for the message, the question. So it's not easy. I think we need to measure it first. We need to see what the data is and then set some targets and quotas. Like the gender parity strategy within the UN, we then need to hold people accountable for those targets and to understand where the bottlenecks are, where the glass ceilings are, where the sticky floors are. It's about culture and policies from how supportive the environment is and whether flexible working is role modeled, whether parental leave is supported, and all the policy aspects. But then it's also about the support and the environment and the mentoring and the sponsorship. It's a whole package. There's no one solution, but I think it does start with leadership and it starts with data and then setting some priorities.
Thank you so much, Fleur. That's actually very true.
Diana, can I quickly come in?
Yes.
Yeah, because I love this question so much, and I think it's so important that we work with companies which are not maybe the forerunners on gender equality so far, and we need to convince the maybe unconvinced. And we have also tools for that at hand, I think, as a global community. I want to mention the UN Women's Empowerment Principles, which is a set of 7 principles. We work with the European Union, a lot with the private sector to really promote these principles. And I'm not going to go into the details, but one of the principles is, of course, to get the political support at CEO level and to make the topic of, bring it to the attention of the CEO and get the commitment, but also to look at value chains. And this I want to mention in the context of aerospace. Where are products for the overall product of our aerospace activities come from? And is there an opportunity also to procure from women and women entrepreneurs and work with companies or industries that maybe have a female CEO? Talk about that in the company and then start to instill the interest of the company to work further on this topic and get a few champions in the country who then run with it. But I think the value chain is one possibility to really see, okay, where are our products coming from? Over.
Thank you. I would agree. Could I say one more thing? I think there's also a diversity argument here that when it's traditionally male dominated in those skills, there's an assumption that men are better at those jobs, and it's trying to just understand, especially with the future of work and the different skills that we need, and what the diversity brings, and making that business case as well.
Thank you to Dagmar and Fleur. A very, very comprehensive answer. There's the security and defense areas, I think, are all more or less affected by this shortfall, unfortunately, whether it's space or it's really the more military traditional sectors. So there's a lot of work to do, I'm afraid, in this area as well. I would like to continue with the questions. There is actually one from, well, actually not one, but a couple questions from Serap that I would like to summarize. So we have one, an interview was done with a university professor in Shanghai by Christian Amarpour from CNN and found that there are several instances of worsening of gender equality and related issues in China. This is keeping in mind the founding of the PRC championed gender equality with quotes like "women hold up half of the sky," to demonstrate shared work roles as opposed to only men holding important positions. What does this mean for the impact of this declaration that holds China's capital city in its name? Can China lead globally on gender equality? And I would like, I think, Serap, if you could elaborate on this, if it is your area of expertise, or if you have any idea on also personal view on this question. But there is another one, which is, how can we make voices of women who are not from the first world nations and are from non-white cultural backgrounds more prominent? And are we doing enough to make these voices more representative through the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action? And of course, there is the last question of Marion Russ, who's very interested to hear more about the concrete COVID-19 related challenges you see for women and girls in the Sahel. And she's also saying, I'd be also curious to hear more about how you make the voices of girls on the ground heard in European context, if there are some concrete initiatives. So a lot of questions just for you, Serap. Thanks for replying to those. I think we
unmuted. Yes, thank you. Let me start more, please, with the last question, and it's about, you know, the question, how does it look like in practice to center the voices and ensure that girls are leading at the end of the day, also, for example, the solutions that they should and are knowing best. I can give some examples from our communities and work and programs from different countries. One I would like to start is our global campaign, which is called Girls Get Equal. And this campaign has been designed and developed by our young women and youth activists across the country, offices and regions where Plan International is, so to say, based. That means from Latin America, of the whole of the wonderful continent of Africa with more than 50 countries, and Asia. So that means what we have done is that we said we would like to, so to say, renew our efforts in creating a campaign which, so to say, is demonstrating that we are walking the talk, right? And this was done deliberately then, first of all, by young colleagues who were leading, so to say, the design, the collaboration, the conversations with the young people in the different countries who were either connected to programs or to Plan International, our country offices themselves. And if you wish, I can share later with you also the making of this campaign, then the, so to say, launch of the campaign, and very much also would like to share with you what all these young women are creating and developing and how they are running this campaign in the different countries across the globe. And we do that also because I think I can combine that with the question, how do we ensure that we also are inclusive in that sense? So inclusive, we are, for example, also having Girls Get Equal clubs in internally displaced settings or refugee, I really don't like the word, in camps and settlements, where, so to say, also refugee, diverse refugee girls, adolescent girls and young women also contribute practically to the campaign, but themselves are leading those clubs as well, where they, so to say, do lessons or themselves create reflections on what they understand under leadership, under feminist leadership, what they, so to say, believe they can contribute to their communities, the regions where they are. They are developing proposals regarding to actors who have more influential power, not at the end they are not more capable or more intelligent, but unfortunately, as we know, they are sitting in the positions of power, so that they are negotiating with them and sharing their recommendations to ensure that change is happening. They are doing also courses with the families, they are doing courses with the communities, they are developing curricula for the classes in the schools, in the education systems. So we try really to enable and give the space where they, so to say, are creating themselves the future they want to see. And also listening to them how we can be, so to say, more continuously of support what they would need from us. Also in regards to people with disabilities as well, we, depending also then on the disabilities, right, we have to also create therefore different materials, different approaches or accesses for those people so that they have the right equipment and the right space made so that they can contribute with their incredible, brilliant minds as well to the creation of materials, toolkits, recommendations, spaces, negotiations with the municipalities, with the leaders of their communities, but also not only that, right? Also with national leaders, ministries, or even cross-border plus regional multilateral organizations or global spaces where we try to do it in a very meaningful manner where they are raising their voices, and we just ensure that they get the access to do so. Then with the non-white colleagues, or I call it always the white privilege, or how do we ensure that, or the Western gaze, that we are not believing that we always have eaten wisdom with the spoons, as we say in German, and that we believe that we have to educate, so to say, because we know better. But I always say, if we knew and would have known better, right? Why don't we say a major giant leap, so to say, in change? And I also think that we had already enough conversations where we always say the communities should lead and they know best. Then I think it's also time that we really ensure that we shift our minds and put them at the center and let them, so to say, talk. And I'm so proud because last Friday we had a webinar with the launch in regards to our Girls in Crisis report. It was our colleague from the Sahel, who is herself from the Sahel, right? Who is now the Sahel director of Plan International. She was talking, she was leading our webinar. And I think we have to do that permanently and frequently. And it was not my role to speak on behalf, so to say, of her lived experience and on behalf of the work that she has done. We couldn't, unfortunately, bring youth who were, so to say, quoted in the report. However, that was because of security reasons and in particular because of COVID-19, but that was also originally the idea that we would have loved to do that. So what we have to do is really just internally in the organizations, if you are a big network as Plan International is, you know, we are present in 80 countries, then we have to ensure that the power is distributed, that we equalize, so to say, the regions and the voices, and that we don't believe that here in Europe or in the north, the center is the one that will create the thought leadership and so on and so forth. No, we have to be at their service. We have to enable, and the rest comes anyway from them because they are there. They know what exactly is needed now, and not we. I'm in Brussels. How should I know what's happening currently in Lagos, for example, right? So we are also in on a journey, right? It's not that we have the perfect solution. I can't say that. However, I can assure you we have those conversations for a long while already. We have changed a lot already within Plan International by having committed ourselves to be a feminist leadership obeying organization, by ensuring that young people are leading also campaigns, for example, that young people can become leaders themselves within our organization as well, plus in ensuring that our regional and country officers across the globe are leading our position papers, that they are, so to say, bringing forward what they believe we should amplify. And yeah, but we have still a long way to go. And with regards to China, I think China is not the only country, right, which hasn't achieved gender equality. And I think all countries have to hold accountable and have to fulfill the commitments that they have ratified and agreed themselves. So I would say this is something that some countries have done better, others less, but I would always hold them accountable for what they have signed themselves to achieve and to do.
Thank you very much, Serap. I have just one more question, and I think this is the last one we can take, and it's for Jakub. Just bear with me, because of course there is an issue with a file. And actually, Raul, if Raul is online, let's try something else. Raul would like to ask, Raul Rios, I will unmute yourself so you can ask your question live to Jakub.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I just wanted to thank everyone for their excellent presentation. I think it's been very insightful and very, very, in some cases, eye-opening. For Jakub, something that really concerned me about your presentation was the statistic that 80% of parliamentarian women face some sort of psychological violence. And, and this got me thinking, does, things like education or maybe other factors don't contribute to kind of like reducing this number, or is there something else that we're not looking at in regards to this? Maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on that. Thank you.
Hi, Raul. Thank you for the question. It's an interesting one, and indeed the statistic is quite striking. So I'm happy that it I understand that it attracts a lot of attention. So maybe I will first clarify a little bit about the statistic itself. So the statistic itself does not relate, just to psychological violence from colleagues or from within the workplace. It's something that's broader. That's something that you face throughout the course of your work. And particularly for parliamentarians who are highly visible and come into contact with a lot of people, not just in person, but also through social media, for example, this visibility shows. And what this particular statistic shows is that indeed the fact that they are publicly visible attracts very high rates of this type of behavior. It's not just from colleagues; it's also from people that they come in contact with through other means. So that's maybe one qualifying thing to this statistic. And then maybe the second part of this question I'd like to take upon, which is the influence of education, even when you consider the violence within workplace settings. There is a lot of factors that underlie harassment in workplace settings that often interact in different ways. And I think the relationship with education is not really all that straightforward. So you would have some workplaces where lots of people would be highly educated, yet you would not have a gender equality friendly workplace culture, or you would have culture that is not that friendly to women and may even deter women from, say, entering these workplaces. So I can give an example that, for example, one of the reasons of why we see, there's many reasons for this, but one of the reasons why we see low rates of women within the ICT sector is also related to workplace culture, and this is a sector that typically requires high education. So there is many factors at play here, and it really depends on how they coincide. So even within workplaces, it's if you have like only higher educated people, it does not mean that you would have a workplace free of harassment.
Thank you so much. Since we're talking about ICT sector, I had a question myself, but I was alternate to leave the floor to others to speak, but we didn't address this area before. So I think my question would be for Dagmar. We have only 5 minutes, unfortunately, but I'll be quick. So recently we are looking at, and UN Women is looking also at technology and innovation as new areas to enhance gender equality and women empowerment, but also to reverse the trend of the so-called digital divide, which will have, of course, a future gender dimension. especially in the area of emerging and disruptive technologies, if we're talking about AI or machine learning and the gender bias embedded into those technologies that we need to tackle, of course, from this perspective. And this was also a commitment of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action back 20 years ago. What do you think we could do globally to reverse the digital gender divide or to take actions in some areas? What are the top 3 actions on top of your head we could take in the technology and innovation sector?
Yeah. I mean, very quickly, because I know time is running up. One thing is to really engage in the discussion with the real big players on technology and innovation, and to have serious discussions, particularly with regard to what you are saying about the unconscious bias, the reinforcement of gender stereotypes and algorithms. And I was really happy with all what Fleur had said about the importance of addressing gender stereotypes. And I think particularly in the field of digitalization and innovation, we can really fall in the same trap that we have fallen into in so many other areas. So it's important to have that discussion, to then involve women in decision making in leadership positions, to bring girls to code. We see a lot of activity in that regard. I think it's really, really important to bring up the young leaders who are really, really knowledgeable on technology, and yeah, to give them the role to really also shape the agenda for the future. And then, of course, I mean, I mentioned already, we will have an action coalition on innovation. And I think that will be also really important because I'm sure a lot of great activities will come out of that.
Oh, that's fantastic. It's good to know, since it's an emerging sector. Thank you.
You are muted, Diana.
I'm muted. I wanted to say thank you, Dagmar, for the answer. It's an emerging sector, so we need to, of course, AI and machine learning and other emerging tech. We need to look at it thoroughly. I think we have only 2 minutes, so I will have to, unfortunately, close this out and wrap up. And I would like first to thank all of you for the very fruitful discussions, the insightful discussions, and a big thank you to the speakers, especially for taking the time to really speak with us tonight. And finally, thank you as well to the YPFP staff that helped me organizing this panel. They've been like critical as well in the organization of this event, that have been smooth and flawless. And thank you lastly to all the participants who have attended tonight. I hope you got inspired. And I'd like to remind you that the next event within the Gender Initiative 2020 that we have organized this year is scheduled on the 16th of July. You can go to the YPFP website and find the link already to register, and it will focus on women's political participation and leadership. So we'll tackle different gender angles, gender dimensions along this initiative that we will, of course, have debates along the year. So again, have a good evening, everyone. And of course, see you next time. And thank you so much again for participating in this event. Thank you.